young the first time I saw the Italian Job, maybe 8 or 10 years old. This would have been the early 1980s, I would guess, and even then it was already a classic. And the thing I remember most was thinking that this movie must have been made on a massive budget because of all the cars that they destroyed. But of course I, like so many, was suckered in by the art of movie magic. Now, Paramount Pictures made this movie, and despite appearances, it wasn't actually made with a massive budget. A guy called David Salamone was given the job of sourcing and preparing the cars. He and his dad owned a company called Blenheim Motors in London, and they supplied vehicles to the film industry. Now, Robert Evans was the head of Paramount Pictures. He was friends with Gianni Agnelli of Fiat, and Agnelli basically opened up the city of Turin for filming. And he allowed them to film on the top of the Fiat building. And in fact, Fiat wanted to supply all the cars for the movie and replace the Mini Coopers with Fiat 600s. And they were prepared to pay for the privilege, unlike BMC. But this, of course, was a patriotic flick, and they really wanted the hero cars to be Minis. As it was, Fiat supplied the Alfa Romeo police cars, several cars in the Turin street scenes, and the Fiat Dinos used by the Mafia. And a Fiat Dino was gifted to director Peter Collinson at the end of filming. Anyway, I don't want to cover all the vehicles here because that would take years. Instead, I'll just focus on the main stars, which are the Mini Coopers, the Lamborghini Miura, Aston Martin DB4, the 2 E Type Jags, and the bus. Now, of all the vehicles that starred in the Italian Job, the Mini Coopers had the biggest role. And these were all Mark I models. And if you hear 50 different stories about these cars, you'll get 50 different answers. Even Michael Dealey, who was one of the producers, said that BMC sold them just 3 cars at trade price, and that they had to buy another 30 at full whack. But I tend to take what David Salamone says as the final word. And he said that there were 6 real cars and a dozen fake ones, as he called them. So the fake cars were all real Minis, but they were just base models tarted up to look like Coopers. And the fake cars were used for the crash scenes and being pushed off the cliff at the end and stuff like that. Now, the 6 genuine Mini Coopers were all supplied by BMC. And according to David Salamone, they were loan cars that had to be returned at the end of filming. And according to him, all 6 survived filming. But they suffered a lot of damage, especially from the jump scene and the sewer scene. Now, Remy Julien oversaw all the stunt work. It was he who suggested several of the stunts that appeared in the film, including jumping between the 2 buildings at the Fiat factory. The sewer scene was actually filmed in Coventry in England and wasn't actually in Italy at all. Now, Julien tried to make one of the Minis do a full loop inside the tunnel, but because there was water on the floor, he couldn't get enough grip. Now, the license plates on all the Mini Coopers ended with the letter G. David Salamone sourced these as unissued numbers from the police. And the reason they wanted the letter G was because of the way the annual registration system works in the UK. G denotes 1969, so even though they were filming in 1968, the film was being released in 1969, so they wanted the Minis to look current. Now, there were 2 each of red, white and blue, supplied by BMC. And as supplied, they all wore 1968 F registrations. And interestingly, one of these cars actually appeared in a Dunlop tyre promotional film about a week after the Italian Job filming had ended. And you can just make out the registration number as supplied by BMC. And interestingly, David Salamone was driving it. So the movie registration plates were all removed after filming. And according to Salamone, the 6 Mini Coopers were all returned to BMC. And they would have been almost certainly scrapped because they were too far gone to polish up and sell. But the movie number plates did survive and they were sold. They came up for auction in 2003 as separate pieces. And then they came up for auction again in 2006 and sold as a set. And a guy called David Morton bought all 3 of them and fitted them to 3 Mini Coopers painted up in red, white and blue. He'd actually built 3 really accurate replicas with the help of Remy Julien, and the plates were fitted to these cars. And he has a website dedicated to the Italian Job Minis. So that appears to be the fate of the Mini Coopers. The original cars were likely scrapped, but 3 accurate replicas were built and fitted with the movie registration plates. Okay, one of the most famous car scenes in all of movie history. Rossano Brazzi drove the Lamborghini Miura in the opening scene up the Great St Bernard Pass. And of course, both car and driver met their grisly demise at the hands of the mafia. And then they were thrown off the side of the cliff and into a river just for good measure. But of course, it was all movie trickery. There were 2 cars used for the scene and both were supplied by Lamborghini. And as has come to light in recent years, the car driven by Brazzi in the opening scene was Chassis 3586. And of course, it wasn't actually harmed in the making of this film. So, what is the background of Chassis 3586? Well, it was a brand new car that Lamborghini had sold, but whose new owner hadn't yet collected. So Lamborghini loaned it to the film studio, seemingly without the owner's knowledge. Now this Miura was painted Arancio Miura and had white pleated seats. And Lamborghini were worried about the seats getting damaged, so they replaced them with black seats. Now, the wrecked Miura was painted the same colour as Chassis 3586. So it wasn't just a happy coincidence that they both happened to be the same colour. And interestingly, the wreck was pushed off the cliff quite late in the day. So the crew decided to retrieve it the following morning. But when they got there, it was gone and it's never been found. Now, as for the Miura driven by Brazzi, people have searched for this car for decades. It's been commonly said that it was missing, but of course that wasn't the case at all. In fact, it was hidden in plain sight. And the story behind its discovery is completely amazing. And it was my buddy Eric Brutin who discovered the car. And I say that in the broadest sense because this wasn't a barn find or anything like that. Eric is part of the French Speed Connection and he buys and sells classic cars and historic racing cars. And he sources cars for customers. Anyway, he had a customer who was looking to purchase a classic car and he was basically open to suggestions. And through his connections, Eric was able to visit a collection in which there was an orange Miura, among other vehicles. Now this was a nice original car in good condition. And after a second visit and inspecting the car more closely, Eric suggested to his customer that a Miura would be a good investment. So a deal was done and the car was bought and transported to French Speed Connection in Paris. And this was in the year 2013. Anyway, when the Miura arrived at their facility, they had a couple of friends who were visiting. And one of them said, "Hey, this car is orange, just like the Italian job Miura." And they all laughed at first, but this was where it all started. Anyway, when Eric got home that night, he watched the opening scene of the Italian job. And straight away, he noticed some details on the film car that matched the car that they'd just purchased. Now the thing with the Miura is that it was displayed as a prototype at the 1966 Geneva Motor Show. And there was so much demand for it, it was basically rushed into production. So the early cars had issues and received constant upgrades and changes. And because they're a high-end car, each one is bespoke. So for a Miura expert, it's possible to pinpoint all the little differences. And then added to the fact that the filming for that scene was on the 28th to the 30th of June in 1968, you can discount all the cars that were built after that. The movie car had specific features that were introduced to the Miura in November 1967. And this was one of the first Miuras to be fitted with white leather seats. And build records show that prior to filming, only 3 Miuras had been built with this interior option. And only one of these was orange. Now the first thing that Eric noticed was that the headrest in the car just purchased matched that in the movie car. And even though the seats were changed for filming, the headrests in a Miura are separate to the seats, and so they remained in the car. And even though this car had white seats, the rest of the interior is black. He had Valentino Balboni view the car, and he confirmed that the interior was original. And this was really important for identifying all the details. And then Eric spent the next 18 months researching and slowly proving that this was indeed the Italian job Miura. Now one detail that Eric was unsure about was the paint. In the movie it looks like it's painted in the darker Rosso Miura, but Eric met with David Salamone and he confirmed that the film rolls and filters used made the paint look darker. So there you have it. I think this was an amazing victory for Eric. And as for his customer, after realizing he'd accidentally bought the most famous Lamborghini in history, he decided to sell it. But not because he wanted to cash in. Rather, he actually just wanted something that he could drive regularly and enjoy, and obviously, that wasn't this car. There were two Aston Martin DB4 convertibles used for filming, plus a Lancia Flaminia GT, which I'll get to shortly. And this was main character Charlie Croker's car, played by Michael Caine. But the DB4 that appears in the early scenes is a different car to that appears in the Italian Alps. The script actually called for a dark blue DB4 convertible, but these cars are incredibly rare, only 70 were ever made. In the end, a silver one was used because that's all that they could find at short notice. Officially, it was Snow Shadow Grey with a red interior. And this was chassis number DB4 1073R. And the registration was 163ELT. And it was a Series 4, of which there were only 30 made. The car that was wrecked was sourced by David Salamone, and apparently it was a real pile. It was painted silver to match the good car, but it was actually a Series 5. Now, David Salamone apparently paid £700 for it, which is about $960 US. Anyway, the Series 5 car was meant to meet its demise by being smashed by a bulldozer and then pushed off a cliff. And the crew had packed it with explosives that were supposed to go off while it was tumbling down the cliff. But they went off early, so the scene had to be aborted while they sourced a replacement car. Now, it wasn't actually possible to get the Series 4 DB4 from London, so Salamone tried to find one in Turin. But in the end, the closest thing that he could find, given he only had 24 hours to do so, was a Lancia Flaminia GT. They kind of hashed it up so it looked like a DB4, and this is what went over the cliff. So, of the two Aston Martins and the Lancia, only the DB4 that appears earlier in the movie survived. And sometime later, it actually appeared in a skit on the Benny Hill show. Remember, Benny Hill played Professor Simon Peach in The Italian Job. Anyway, the original DB4 still exists and has since been restored. There were two Series 1 E Type Jaguars in the movie, and one was a red 1961 Roadster. And this was actually a really early car, just the 12th E Type built. And it was apparently the first E Type to be raced. This car was apparently the demonstrator for the Leicester Jaguar dealership when it was new. Now, Salamone said he paid about £900 for it, and he bought it from Richard Asami, who played the character of Tony in the film. Anyway, in the film it looked like it was wrecked. The bulldozer crushed the windscreen frame and the hood. But the car was repaired following filming and later restored. I believe these days it's owned by publisher and author Philip Porter. And it makes regular appearances at car shows and is pretty active in the classic scene. The second E-Type was a fixed-head coupe. It was first registered in March 1962, and from what I understand it was actually painted green from the factory. But by the time it appeared in the film, it had changed colour. Like the E-Type Roadster, Salamone paid £900 for it. When watching it being smashed by the bulldozer, it actually looks like it's been damaged beyond repair. The roof looked to be completely crushed. Then producer Peter Collinson added to the effect by smashing the hood with a sledgehammer. Now, given this was a pretty cheap car by 1968, you'd assume it was just sent off to the crusher. But, amazingly, it was repaired. It's gone underground somewhat and it doesn't make regular appearances like the Roadster, but it has survived. And finally, the bus. This was a 1964 Bedford VAL-14, and it had Harrington Legionnaire bodywork. And apparently it was pretty rare, being one of only 59 built. So it was actually rarer than the Aston Martin. Anyway, it was modified so the Minis could be driven into the back via ramps while it travelled down the autostrada. And despite the chances of the driver being crushed, if something went wrong, steel plating was added behind the seat. And this pushed the driver's seat forward by several inches. The Bedford was also used for moving equipment around for filming. And after filming ended, it was pressed back into service. It worked for years in Scotland, and at one time, it was a school bus. Thousands of people would have travelled on it and not even realised it was a movie star. Anyway, despite its former fame, the Bedford was decommissioned in the early 1990s, and unfortunately, it was scrapped. That seems like a pretty sad ending for one of the world's most famous buses. Anyway, that's all I've got for you folks. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please hit the like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to share. That's what I make these things for. Anyway, until next time, we will see you then. See ya.